Good afternoon and good morning to everyone from coast to coast, and welcome to today's webinar, Doing More with Less, Solutions for Managing Facilities on a Limited Budget. My name is Eric Nolan. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager at Sightlines. I will also be your moderator for today's session, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. We are thrilled to be spending this time with each and every one of you. Today's session will feature Pete Sarah, Vice President of Market Strategy and Development at Sightlines, and Jay Perlman, Associate Vice President for Sightlines. Following a brief introduction and review of housekeeping items from me, we'll be breaking up our agenda today into two sections. First, Pete will set the context for today's topic by sharing some recent industry trends that we think you will all find interesting. Pete, if you can go to the next slide there, so people can see the agenda.
I'm afraid I can't.
Oh, no.
Oh, no is correct. It's not moving forward. Do you want to take it back?
Yes. Give me 1 second. Sorry, everyone. A little technical difficulties here. Okay, I hope everyone can see my screen. Jay and Pete, can you guys confirm that you can see the screen? So I want to make sure.
We can.
Okay. Let's just see. Okay. Okay, sorry about that. A little delay there. So I'll introduce today's speakers. So today's session will feature Pete Sarah, Vice President of Market Strategy and Development at Sightlines, and Jay Perlman, Associate Vice President for Sightlines. Following a brief introduction and review of housekeeping items from me, we'll be breaking up our agenda into two sections. First, Pete will set the context for today's topic by sharing some recent industry trends that we think you all find interesting, and we'll follow that with a discussion on the 3 proven practices for doing more with less. We'll then transition over to Jay, who will guide us through a quick service demonstration for those who are interested in learning more about the measurement, benchmarking, and analysis process that help to lead these transformations on campus. And of course, lastly, we'll set aside some time at the end of each section to respond to any questions or comments that are submitted along the way or that were submitted prior to today's session. With this in mind, I'd like to remind you all that if you have any questions or comments during the presentation for either Pete, Jay, or myself, please don't hesitate to share those with us as you think of them. We'd like this to be an interactive session, and we very much look forward to answering any questions that come up along the way. I'll be monitoring them throughout the presentation, and as I mentioned before, we'll do our best to address each and every one of them towards the end of each section. To submit a question or comment, simply enter it in the questions box on your control panel, and they will be sent directly to us. To continue with the housekeeping notes and to answer one question up front that we typically receive, following today's session, each of you will receive an email that contains links to both the presentation slides and webinar recording for your continued engagement with this material. We'll also be sure to include some complimentary content that we think you might find valuable as well. So keep an eye out for that email tomorrow. I'd also like to call your attention to the handouts section on your control panel. Handouts gives you instant access to complimentary resources such as previous webinar presentations, best practice guides, trends, and benchmarking reports. And you'll also find case study documents for the 3 member institutions that we'll be highlighting today. You can check those out at any time during the session, and we absolutely encourage you to do so. Now, before I hand this off to Pete, I'd like to quickly provide a short introduction to Sightlines for those who are joining us for the first time today. The way I like to describe us is that we're the investment advisor for educational facilities. We're working with hundreds of institutions every year to try to help them find ways they can use their capital more strategically and also identify opportunities to be more effective stewards of their campus, both operationally, financially, and environmentally. Using our leading database of verified facilities metrics allows us to do this, as we're able to help finance, facilities, and sustainability professionals make more informed, data-driven decisions about the future of their most valuable assets. And we've been honored to work with hundreds of institutions across North America every year. We work with approximately 450 colleges and universities in 43 states and Canada, and this gives us unparalleled perspective on the state of higher education facilities and industry trends and best practices. And it's that perspective that is going to play a big role in what Pete and Jay are going to be talking about this afternoon. I also want to quickly mention that Sightlines is a Gordian company. Gordian provides data, software, and expertise for all phases of the building lifecycle. And with that, I will wrap up here and pass it off to Pete to get us started. So take it away, Pete.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks for the text save as well. Appreciate that. I'll let you continue to drive. I'm delighted to be with everybody today. Everything we do at Sightlines happens within the context of the data, the qualified data that we've gathered from, about, and really for the institutions we've served and are serving. That context helps us appreciate the challenges you face, challenges like infrastructure and capital funding, but also the institutional-wide challenges, right, around aid or enrollment. And maybe somewhere in all of that, you get to talk about deferred maintenance and deferred maintenance challenges. There isn't a Sightlines presentation that happens that doesn't talk about building age. And the constructed space graph that you see before you is familiar for anyone who has seen a presentation from us or works with us. It's the story that we tell that reminds us that a tremendous amount of the square footage on every campus across the country was constructed between the mid-50s and the late 70s, with another big boom happening later in the last 15 years or so. Those buildings from the post-war and modern eras are buildings of great challenge on our campuses. They are often of questionable quality in terms of construction technique. They are difficult architecturally, be that aesthetically or the flexibility that they do or don't provide for an evolving institution. And they're often compromised by hazardous materials. The newer buildings are better, but they're more sophisticated. They're more complicated. That complexity can shorten life cycles or make day-to-day stewardship and supervision of those buildings ever more challenging. Now, locally, you may be different, and it's important through all of this discussion that you think about where you are in your setting. What you see on the screen is what Texas looks like, which is a little bit different than the rest of our database, and the growth that they are seeing in Texas continues to go up in terms of the construction that's happening on their campuses across the state. And so keep that in mind. Remember throughout this presentation that you want to put your own particular context on all of these graphs and charts that we show and these stories. With regard to space on campus, the last decade has shown us a story that ebbs and flows throughout the history of colleges, where in the late part of the last decade, we saw a surge in enrollment on campuses and we didn't have enough space to keep up with it. And as we all know, the building of space requires time to start the process, to get them funded, and then to build them. And sure enough, when enrollment flattens out, we may still be building buildings, and that's what we've seen in our database. It is something to keep in mind, and it's one of the reasons that everyone's cautioned about being sure that you really need the space you're going to build before you build it. Are you sure that those trends are going to continue? In Texas, it sure seems like it's been continuing for some time, but everybody across the country wants to keep that in mind. Backlogs continue to rise in our database. We have crossed over the $100 threshold on average across the country. For some parts of the country, that is a devastatingly large number, and others, frankly, it's just business as usual. But a couple key things. The $100 mark reminds us that we are reaching a point where day-to-day maintenance is shifting from the proactive to the reactive as the needs become so great that you're spending more time fighting fires than actually preparing for life cycle changes and anticipating them. It also represents a moment in time where we have to reflect on whether we're really ever going to be able to take our backlogs back towards zero. Maybe we have to learn to live with a new operating reality where there are significant backlogs, at least for the foreseeable future. But a 22% growth since 2007 is daunting nonetheless. In the case of capital investment, what we see is that it's been really flat over the last decade. And that flat means that there is money coming in, there is investment happening, but it's not been growing at the rate at which the needs have increased, and that is certainly one source of that change in deferred maintenance that we saw on the previous slide. It also means that as we move forward in time and there's not enough capital, hard decisions need to be made about what the spending priorities are, and whether we tackle the newest, hippest programs or the older buildings which continue to nag us from that big surge that happened back in the 50s. Those waves of construction are creating ever more stress on our capital funding. On the operating side of things, we've seen very modest growth over the last decade. Now, it's fair to say that inflation has been growing at a pretty modest rate over the last decade from much of the country. But that almost flat period between 2009 and 2012 has been moderated by only a modest 2 to 2.5% increase since that time. And we don't see that changing at all in our campuses. If anything, there's some retrenchment. And so facility and operating budgets are not the place to go if you're going to be looking for extra cash to address some of those deferred needs issues. We're not painting the prettiest picture. We're trying to paint the reality of what we see in the database and assure you that you are not alone if this is a familiar case for you. Now, there is at least one bright spot. Energy budgets have been able to benefit from a reduction in unit cost across the country, fueled in great measure by the move to natural gas in many places where natural gas prices have fallen, and in some cases, other fossil fuels have fallen in response to that. It has presented an opportunity for the enlightened institutions to either redirect that money to another portion of their campus, hopefully into their facilities portfolio, or to sequester that money, to put it away for a time when we may see a rebound in energy cost. Anyone who's been around for more than a few years knows that this current downturn is not likely to persist. And if there's anything we've learned in this regard from the recent hurricanes that have happened in the southern part of this country is that energy costs can be pretty volatile pretty quickly. The big picture for us, though, is that we believe that the greatest challenge is understanding in an integrated way how to be responsible campus stewards, how to link space, how to link capital and operations, and to develop the facilities intelligence that allows that connection to be both integrated and effective in communicating across the entirety of the institution about what's going on. So let's get into a couple of those practices. Let's talk about a couple of those things. It's important for me to say these are not efforts to optimize systems or simply learn how to live with less by cutting service or using the newest whiz-bang toys. It's not even about training. The idea is that this is a discussion about ways you can bring the facilities knowledge to the larger institution and make changes that not only impact everyone but can be supported by them as well. The three topics listed here, finding the hidden value in existing space, cost reduction projects, offsetting capital investment, and reorganization, are not simply about reduction, but about creativity and innovation being exhibited by peers on the ground today. So let's get into them. The first is hidden value in existing space, and it's really about not overlooking the familiar. Right, it's already available. It is easy to grow comfortable with the existing situation and miss creative opportunities for any of us who spend time on a campus for a period of time. The first and foremost issue is always to investigate your existing space, and it's important to know how much you have, where it is, how it's being used, and what its condition is. And that's a regular process. An assessment done 10 years ago likely doesn't reflect either the condition or, frankly, the current uses. Educational programs are dynamic and shifting and on a regular basis, and they may or may not match up smoothly. So some sort of assessment, whether it's an internal assessment or one that's driven by outside entities, is necessary. You want to assess program for space fit. Are the spaces meeting the needs? Have programs changed? Are spaces underutilized because they're just not liked? Office space might be lost in a department that's contracted or grown. How does the class schedule or other fixed elements of the faculty life and student life force a particular response by the buildings? And could they change again? And maybe they have already. The space is still configured for the past, but there's a whole new paradigm that's in place. So it's important that you understand that program and space fit so that you can begin to renovate to optimize both. Right, a fixed heat classroom like that archaic one depicted in that image probably doesn't meet pedagogy, but where do you go with it? Do you return it to the best version of what it was, or do you completely change the way that space works because it matches pedagogy? Labs were designed for big science many years ago, but now there's a small and almost digital science happening. are you not just returning it to where it was, or are you bringing it to some new space that links those and optimizes them? And finally, efficiency. Space reconfigurations can create new efficiencies in space use that are astonishing. Frankly, people are roughly the same size they were, but nearly everything else we use and engage with has reduced in size. So flexible office spaces and nimble communications and technology tools, even the mechanical equipment that we're often responsible in facilities organizations, the lighting, the infrastructure is physically smaller, and you want to take advantage of that to optimize what happens. We're going to talk about a couple slides here that mirror a case study that can be found that we've worked with Seattle Pacific, and we'll provide you that linkage in the final presentation that we share with you. Here's an example of a scheduling analysis done at an institution. Everybody's probably done a scheduling analysis at some point, but in this particular case, it shows a couple familiar issues, that there are days of the week that are less heavily used than others, but there are also some really big gaps, and those big gaps mean that there are times of the day that are forced in the schedule because of activity on that campus that mean that up to 62 courses of worth of space is underutilized throughout the week. That's 15% increase in courses over the existing schedule at this campus, and boy, that's a heck of a lot of space going underutilized and something to be thought about. But how do you value that? How do you articulate it? How do you describe it? Well, one of the ways is to put a value on that, a dollar value on that CFOs and boards can understand. If you have this kind of 68,000 square feet of space and you think about what its capital cost is, what its O&M cost is over 40 years, what its stewardship cost is to care for it for a life cycle, you can put a dollar figure on the capital cost of those classrooms. And then if you think about that utilization rate and you look at whether it's underutilized or fully utilized, you might find that you have $20 or $30 million of capital cost that's being underutilized. And that's $500,000 per point in this case. Certainly a CFO is going to be able to have a much more stern or clear conversation with the provost about why building new space doesn't make sense until we take advantage of it. If we can say that every time we increase usage by a percentage point, we're saving or avoiding $500,000 worth of use. It's a really, really powerful way to think about existing space. Another thing that you can work your way into is thinking about this cost reduction projects. We all know that capital projects can be drains that don't offer a big return on investment, and utilities are the ones that get the biggest hit sometimes because it's just stuff gets old. But we know that there are also cases where it's leaking or there's something not working, and we want to try if you can find out whether there are cost reduction opportunities that exist within our total project, not just in those energy issues. So again, this comes back to understand your existing facility situation. Where is it? What are its conditions? What is your budget? How are you spending? Where are you spending the money? Is it going to the places you want it to go? What is your full understanding of your facilities expenditures and patterns? And how are you controlling that or being controlled by it? Once you understand that, you can develop a spending strategy, right? Is energy savings a priority? How about eliminating maintenance-intensive buildings or systems? Is there a building type that's particularly troubling? Is it that group of buildings in the 50s, or is it something about what's happening in recent construction that you're regretting 10 years in? What are the things that you can do to align programs with space and maybe reduce labor-intensive support? Linking together a spending strategy and a policy on your projects so that you can target these kinds of objectives, not just fixing what's broken. Once you've done that, managing how a project can address these operating needs, you can begin to prioritize, and you can create a capital strategy that is focused on projects where there will be some return as well as critical deferral need addressed. And capital investment will be maximized, and the pain of debt is reduced, or frankly, the joy of gifts is enhanced for those that are gift funded. And then finally, it's important to monitor and measure the performance changes. You need to know what your practice is before and then also know what it is afterward, because it's critical that once these changes are made, you're able to continue to tell the story about how you've been able to avoid costs, reduce costs, or put monies that you've saved from energy savings or other kinds of labor savings, if that's your objective, back into the operation to help support other capital investment or to optimize your operating budget. And so that practice can be the chosen approach for the institution the next time around. In many cases, these steps are necessary in order to convince a committee, a CFO, when you change CFOs, or a committee that's run by faculty or others on campus that are helping to make budget planning decisions. If you have these strategies in place and you have these stories you can tell, it's much easier to get them on board to understand why this practice makes sense. Again, we're going to refer to you at a case study at Hamilton College, but we're going to show some examples of some that mirror that kind of work in the upcoming slides. So let's say historically you had a target investment on your campus, and you were trying to make sure that if you invested in this area, something we predict, help institutions predict, you know that you can keep up or even make some ground on the deferral that's been happening. Here's an example of an institution that made the decision to make a very, very large capital investment over a period of time for its size, and was able to begin to chip away and really stabilize their campus. It was a combination of annual stewardship dollars, the dark gray, but the money that comes every year, and that one-time big surge investment that's there in powder blue. That allowed them to really get their hands around the problem, but they also knew that big-time capital funding was going to go away. And so they began very early on in this cycle to start telling this story of what's going to happen once we make that investment. We're going to be able to streamline our operations. We're going to be able to do more preventative maintenance. We're going to do more planned maintenance, but we need to grow that annual commitment on a yearly basis so that we're prepared for that ongoing care that we need to make in the future. And so they had conversations in this case with a committee, and that committee saw the rationale of this. They saw that they could avoid making $16 million investments if they could get more money in that recurring in stewardship over time. It's the pay me now or pay me later story that we've heard so often. And in this case, that story worked. So as the decade went on, that one-time funding went away. But after 10 years, there'd been a more than 400% increase in the ongoing annual stewardship, an ability for an institution to plan for that, to prepare for it, to adjust their budgets over time. It meant that when the big surge was done, we weren't reacting at the last minute, but the institution was reacting over a decade, putting itself in position to carry forward and care for the facilities that they had renovated and put in place. What's more important is that it now positions them to be thinking about the next 10 years. So looking forward toward the next 10 years, they have the ability to think about what their needs are going to be, and focus on not just how big they are, but really bear down. Think about whether they're mechanical demands or envelope demands or just renewal demands. And in that prediction ability, they can begin to see when they're going to have bumps, some challenges in the future, a time when they may not have the right amount of mix, or they can't even take on that much project work at a given time because they can't do that much work in 1 year. How do they address it? How do they think about it? Given that they've got a 10-year plan out front, and given that they've had conversations with their CFO and their committees, they're able to think about strategies for deploying money so that they can steer it to be more balanced in the future. They can think about the actual allocation on a case-by-case basis and change what it is. In the early years, on this slide, you see that they're pretty modest expenditures that they're looking for, and there's a reasonable balance. But as you get toward the end, it's obviously becoming a very different story. And so what they're able to do is think about how to deploy those things differently, and maybe even start to talk about PM. Can they deploy their PM resources to focus on the buildings that are coming up in 25, 26? Eric, if you can move that slide forward. One more slide. Yeah, thank you. They can think about allocating PM so they can begin to prepare for caring for those buildings that are in out years, and therefore also be able to start shifting and planning the work and the work that's going to be done so that they can flatten out that big mechanical surge that was going to happen in 26 to a more manageable piece of work over multiple years. And they're doing this now in 2017, well in advance of the time which they're going to hit it in 24, 25, and 26. Very, very exciting, all because they were able to think about and plan for and coordinate that work in advance. So let's try the third case. Reorganization as a means to help eliminate deferred maintenance. Now, let's be frank, this isn't for everybody because not everybody's organization is nimble enough or is in a place where it needs to be reorganized. But it's always important to look into whether the organization is set up to handle not just the problems of today or yesterday, but the problems of tomorrow. Unlike Hansel and Gretel, the way into trouble isn't always the best way back out. So this is a story about consolidating maintenance, but what we want to talk about is why are the things, what do you want to think about as you're thinking about your maintenance organization? The first and foremost is the facilities team a team for today, or is it one for yesterday? Is it tied to an earlier campus world, an earlier set of expectations, an earlier set of paradigms? Is it a structure around communications and technologies of paper instead of smartphones and tablets? Does it reflect labor requirements that are no longer in use? Does it take full advantage of today's more highly mobile and frankly sophisticated employees? Would the team actually have less work if the buildings were operated in a different way and cared for in a different way? Is it responding to the programs that are in place today, or is it responding to practices of yesterday or many, many days ago? How also is the organization measured and benchmarked and monitored? We need to measure the current and the future performance so that we can understand whether or not the changes could be made or should be made, and then ultimately document that the changes have been effective. Without appropriate measures and benchmarks, it's just really difficult, if not impossible, to demonstrate to leadership, as well as the employees themselves, that a change needed or that it has been beneficial once it's implemented. You may have a maintenance management system, but are you using it? And how are you using it? Are you using it in the most effective way to grab hold of what you have, or is it simply a way to measure the tremendous amount of work that's passing through your organization? And what other measures do you understand in terms of how other schools, other institutions, other parts of your institution are tracking their people and utilizing those people? All of those need to be folded into understanding how you're measuring the performance of that existing team. Most organizations we work with are blessed with smart, committed employees that are eager to serve the mission of their institution. But sometimes there isn't money for more of them, even though square footage, for each custodian, maintenance person, even though the square footage for custodians and maintenance people that we see is growing, there just may not be enough money to carry that forward. So what are you doing to make sure they're deployed in a structure that optimizes their skills and resources? Are they entrusted with sufficient responsibility to leverage those skills? Again, is this an organization that takes advantage of the sophistication and engagement going forward? And then finally, none of that matters if there isn't a strategy to focus the work. So what understanding is in place of the needs looking forward? What do the next 10 years look like? Do you know what the next 10-year prediction model is and where your staff should be focused? Do you know what buildings are in need? And are buildings in great shape because a large capital push is coming to address needy buildings? How do you focus on modernization? How do you focus on infrastructure? Having a clear focus on what that need is going to help you deploy those people. This case study that we're discussing is based on Bowling Green, and you can see the case at that location, web location, listed there. So if we look at some examples, here's a graph that could be exciting or scary depending on where you are in the picture. If you weren't planning for space growth and you weren't anticipating a drop in those blue bars of headcount, you might be very frustrated that you now have fewer people to take care of more. The flip side is if you're preparing for this and you're planning for it and you were working in the organization, this might be a very exciting chart to see that you're optimizing your staff, maybe living with even fewer if that's your objective, and you're still doing it for greater square footage. The point is that this kind of graph is not atypical, and the question you have to ask yourself is, how are you prepared to take it on, and are you prepared to take it on as an opportunity as opposed to a giant challenge? In this particular case, the institution was looking to centralize, right? The resources had been distributed, and it was difficult to understand what was happening. The case for centralization meant getting a better handle on preventative maintenance scheduling. It meant the ability to really be proactive in the focus of everyone across the institution and not have those decisions be made on a localized basis. It was also a chance for accountability to be shifted to the central part of the institution. Often when people are deployed in a distributed fashion, the responsibility is local, the connection with the people is local, but sometimes that means when something goes wrong, there's not an ability to react in an effective and broad-based way. And finally, coordination and planning and scheduling with customers is enhanced if it can be centralized, or at least that was the argument in this case. Oftentimes, it takes multiple trades over periods of time to get the work done, and the ability to coordinate that with a customer is greatly enhanced if there's some kind of centralization of that. Those are several of the examples here that were the case for centralization. Now, there are potential challenges when you change your organization in any way. Those challenges can be about expectation management. When you change the rules, people expect it to be the same. If they had someone working close by them, they're going to want to continue to see that person, and you need to help them understand why that change is going to work. They're going to want the same kind of maybe knee-jerk reaction that they had with someone close by, that they're going to have to work through a coordinated system, and you're going to have to help them understand why that change is not only going to be better for them, it's going to help hold you more accountable. Policy and procedure standardization when you consolidate is a challenge because there may be different things happening across different zones of the campus, right? Different regions of the campus, and it's important for the organization to be effective to get those things to be standardized. Consistency in expenditures is certainly a big issue because everyone may have been solving the same problem differently, and moving to a place where everyone is thinking the same way and spending the same way so that procurement strategies can be normalized, standards can be established across campus to reduce inventories, and response times can be normalized based on expenditure, all means that there's got to be some discipline, and that involves the finance office, that involves every single person down to the trades level in terms of how they're moving and how they're planning and how they're making that work. And finally, habits are hard to break. People have to be coached through the process of releasing some of their former responsibilities and shifting responsibilities. They may be responsible for a piece of the campus, and now they're responsible for a stretch of work across a much broader part of the campus. Letting those go, letting the change happen, has to be coached and has to be prepped for well in advance in order to not have it blow up in your face. Now, one of the advantages that many institutions see in a consolidation scenario is that they get a better handle on the work being done. When folks are distributed, sometimes the work doesn't get recorded, and sometimes it can be astonishing how much work wasn't being tracked in a central database that is tracked when the consolidation happens. In addition, there's an opportunity to change the dynamic of that work, to move to greatly enhance the amount of work that is planned and not reactive. And we all believe and we all know that planned work is less expensive work, it's less disruptive work, it's more effectively delivered work. And so the ability to move more and more work to planned is critical. It may also be there's just a way to track and prove that you're doing more planned work, because there may have been some really amazing people doing planned activity, but you're just not aware of it. So at the very least, you get to find out all the really great things that your team is doing. Finally, I think it's important to note that communication through all of this is the key. These are some familiar groups that have to be communicated with. The key, though, is to communicate with them as you're thinking about the change, communicate with them as you're choosing to make the change, and then communicate with them during the change, and finally, be able to demonstrate to them at the end what is happening and how it has worked out, and how they can help them be excited about the change that's happening. Yes, that means the people on the ground delivering the work within the facilities organization and their management team. It means institutional leadership, so they understand why something that is potentially disruptive and is going to create some friction across the campus should be taken up because of the advantages it's going to bring both in service and in dollars. It means grabbing hold of key members of the faculty and the staff and the students and letting them know. Maybe it's leadership committees, maybe it's just influential people, but helping them, or maybe it's needy departments, helping them know what's coming and get them excited about it in advance, and then show them the ways in which they're benefiting from it in the end. And because these are colleges and universities, you can't forget the community. It might affect your alumni. It may affect the way in which you work with regional governments. It may affect the way in which you serve neighbors. And there may be others that I'm not thinking about. But communicating with all of those folks before you even make the decision and then throughout the process is crucial if you're going to make something as dramatic a change as a consolidation in your staff. So those are the three cases that we have. We hope you get a chance to enjoy them on our website at those locations, but we would be glad to take some questions now before we let you spend some time with Jay, for those of you who are interested in talking about any of our processes and techniques.
Okay, thank you, Pete. That was great. Well, that wraps up the first part of today's session. So let's get right to the questions. And to see right now, we just have one, and I think it's actually more of a comment than a question that I'm sure the audience would love to get your take on it. It refers to the energy unit cost from earlier in the presentation during the setting the context. But the comment is, energy unit cost is reduced due to strong stewardship and immense efforts to be more energy efficient, as well as campuses going into alternative energy things, solar, wind, geothermal, etc. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, as it's just more of a comment on that trend rather than a question.
Absolutely. I think it's a fantastic point. That's a fantastic point, right? That was a slide particularly focused on rate change and the fact that rate whether or not there's a concerted sustainability effort on your part, whether or not there's just good discipline in management of the issues. There's absolutely a tremendous amount of opportunity that's happening, and the sustainability work that's happening on campuses, in particular to drive to wind and to solar and to other forms of energy, is also indeed reducing both the cost on balance, but also the overall consumption on campuses. And it's a key portion, it's a key opportunity. The real question, regardless of where the savings come from and the motivation, is hopefully the ability of the institution to stay enlightened and reward, frankly, the institutional exercise, right, by putting that money back into the energy budget, putting that money back into the facilities organization to continue those trends, to continue to find more savings, or to use those savings to help others within the facilities organization that are serving the campus.
All right, thanks, Pete. It looks like that's it for now. Kind of a quiet group, but we'll set aside a few more minutes so if you have any additional questions for Pete, please feel free to continue submitting those now. While we wait for more questions to trickle in, and while we still adjust with the slides here, I'd like to let you all know that you will be receiving a post-webinar survey at the conclusion of today's session. It's a short survey that should probably only take about a minute or two to complete. It's designed to not only get your thoughts on the content of today's presentation, but to also get a sense for the challenges that you face on campus, and with those in mind, what topics you'd like to hear from us at future events and in future reports. It goes without saying, we really love to hear from all of you. Well, it still looks like we're Jeff, you can just swap displays there and we should be okay. Looking over the questions one more time. It looks like we've addressed all the questions that are for Pete. So now, as promised, for those who are interested in learning more and would like to stick with us for a bit longer, I'll hand this over to Jay to quickly demonstrate the multi-phased approach that helped these institutions from today's presentations tell their facility story and make the case for change on campus. It looks like, Jay, if you can, again, switch screens. So
yeah, I'm having a little technical difficulty again.
The transitions are not running smoothly today.
We're going to try one more thing, and then I'm just going to go with it if I can't get it working right. No, it's
okay.
Give me.
I'll just take it back over here. There we go.
How about this?
Sorry, everyone. We'll attempt to try it one more time. Yeah,
no.
Yeah, still seeing the split screen.
Okay. All right, well, you can have it back.
Okay.
Okay.
I promise we'll get this figured out, folks. All right.
All right. Well, thank you, guys. What we wanted to do quickly by request was actually talk about the way that we're able to have access to all of the information which Pete just spoke about. So what I'm going to do is essentially go back and tell a little bit of story. And it goes back to 2000 and when we were trying to initially develop this model. And it goes back to a workshop that we hosted in Massachusetts at an ICUBO meeting. We had about 50 or so business officers in a room, and we asked them a bunch of questions regarding their finances. We went through and asked them, how many people in here know the value of your endowment? And everyone's hands was up. And well, how many people in here know the draw rate on that endowment or the return on that? And everybody's hands were still up. We then said, of the people that have their hands raised, we said, how many people in here can tell me the replacement value of your facilities? About half the hands went down. And then we said, how many people in here can tell me the deferral rate on those facilities? And another went down. How about the investment mix? And the hands went down again. The same questions that we asked regarding finances could not be answered regarding physical assets of the institution. What's important about that is when you look across all of higher ed, with the exception of the top 0.5% of institutions in the United States, physical assets tend to be worth 4 to 5 times that of financial assets. So what this showed us is there was a gap. And the same level of rigor to measure, monitor, and benchmark financial assets was simply not there on the facilities side. The biggest asset manager on campus, who is your plant manager, didn't have the same tools as the endowment manager had. And that's what we set out to create. And we developed what's called the ROPA, Return on Physical Assets process. That is the process today that fuels our benchmarking and analysis process that Eric spoke about earlier. And what does it do? You know, it is a comprehensive data collection and analysis model. And you know, Pete talked about a lot of the risks facing institutions today, talking about aging facilities, the need for increased investment. And what this model does is essentially let the facilities manager and the business officer make the case without the guesswork. Essentially, it's about making sure that when you're talking about decisions that affect the long-term viability of an institution, you're not doing it anecdotally. You're doing it with the best available information about your institution and institutions like yours. So at its heart, what it attempts to do is identify. Basically, we validate that core facilities information on your campus so we can distinguish fact from fiction. We take that information, we analyze it, and we develop strategic plans that line up with institutional goals. We have to take those goals and then use predictive analytics to project to the future. And then finally, we have to align those needs with an investment strategy so that we can determine and actually achieve the outcomes that we want. There you go. At the end of the day, the primary benefits that we see is creating that alignment that Pete talked about earlier. It's how do we have a single message that aligns space, capital, and operations? How do we reduce those risks of failures? And how do we increase annual stewardship, as we talked about also, of that aging plant? Can we develop strategies to help to fund deferred maintenance? Are there ways that we can reduce overhead? What are the numbers bear out there? And then finally, you know, sort of wrapping that all up, let's have a verified baseline of information so we can continuously measure and improve. So having access to all that information, being able to make the case, fundamentally changes the conversation at the institution. And what we call that is from boiler room to boardroom. Being able to share common vocabulary and understanding of facilities needs and, quite honestly, deficiencies in a fully transparent, open discussion across multiple aspects of the institution. The way that we do that is by measuring, benchmarking, analyzing, and then what we call membership. Number one, measure. Our team goes to every campus every year. We collect all of this information ourselves. We take it home, we put it through our validation, and we come back and we take you through that as well. We want to make sure that things that are red flags to us, we're talking about, and things that are red flags to you, we're talking about as well. And once and only once we know that we have the information correct, we benchmark to other institutions so that we can put you in the context of schools that are like you. Finally, once we compare you with schools, we're able to interpret that and then understand what are the strategies that are going to make sense, that are specific to your campus, that are going to help make you more successful, and then we can measure and update that every year. And then finally, membership. There's access to our online member portal, which provides you the ability to actually make your own benchmarks, member-only events, webinars, papers, etc. So I mentioned that common vocabulary earlier, and this is really one of the most important concepts within the ROPA process, which is how do we develop that language that helps us tell the story from the boardroom to the boiler room, as I spoke about earlier. And what we've done is divide facilities operations and facilities metrics into 4 families. There are what we call families with respect to asset value. And those are annual stewardship versus asset reinvestment. Pete spoke about this a bit, but annual stewardship is more about the annual investment required to keep up with needs of the campus. Asset reinvestment is more of that capital or more one-time funding to address the backlog or the catch-up needs of the institution. And then on the other side, we have 2 families that are more operational. We're looking at operational effectiveness, which are a lot of the typical nuts and bolts benchmarks that one would expect. Things like staffing level, utilities, work order production, supervision. And then we're going into the final family, which is customer service. At the end of the day, our departments exist to provide an environment for our customers. Well, how well served do they feel? And we're really looking at 3 things there. We're looking at an evaluation of the delivery process. We're doing a cursory evaluation of space, general repair, cleanliness, curb appeal type of an evaluation. And then finally, we ask them. So usually we do an online questionnaire to a group of students, faculty, and staff to get their view of the physical environment in which they work. The process that we go through really has 3 phases that help us to develop that continuous improvement model. The discovery process is the foundation, and that's where we are collecting all of that information and learning about your institution. Historically, where have you been? And what are those things that are going to make you successful in the immediate term? We then layer on predictive analytics over that, and those are things that allow us to look at capital requirements in the future, better understand risks, and identify future operating needs as well. And then there's performance measurement. It's being able to establish what your strategic objectives are, look at what best-in-class institutions in those areas are accomplishing, and then create a course to become one of those best-in-class institutions. And this is just a quick snapshot of the information that we collect. It's really broken down amongst just profile information, financial information, and then more fine-grained operating data. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I'm going to jump into the next slide, which really go into why we collect this information. And I'm going to follow that model of space, capital, and operations. With space, what do we collect? We collect information on the actual facilities themselves: square footage, construction dates, renovation, history. We want a functional description of the space. We also want to know what sort of utility connections the space has. And we use that to determine the functional profile of the campus and age profile. We're looking at technical complexity, and then finally density analysis. And why do we do that? We do that because even though these are probably a group of the simplest metrics that we collect, they are oftentimes the most revealing. And that is, using this information, we're able to tell, well, how does my age distribution impact risk? How does my space profile, just the actual spaces themselves, affect how I provide daily services? Do I have that right mix of space as when I look at mission? Do I have too much square footage? Do I have too little square footage? Both is actually a problem. Can I afford the space that I have? And then finally, all of that evaluated in the context of how do those findings compare to schools like mine. Some examples of a particular institution's metrics, we are able to present these and talk about what they mean. If you look at that graph on the upper right side, Pete talked about this earlier. It's one of the most important graphs that I think we have. Just being able to show those waves of construction really tells me whether I should expect to encounter a more reactive organization, or how prevalent I think that backlog ought to be, even before I dive into what those numbers are. Next, we look at capital investment. We collect your historical spending, and that is by location, by line item. So we want to know where you're spending your money. If you've had a deferred maintenance study done, we'd like to collect that. If you have an M&R or R&R project list for current and or future needs, we want that. There's a master plan or any plans for new construction or recently constructed spaces. We want to collect all of that information to begin to paint the capital picture a bit more clearly. We use that to determine your target. How much should you be spending every year, which is one of the most important things that we do. We want to understand annual funding. We want to begin to look at how much you're deferring every year. So does the funding meet those needs? And then finally determine what an appropriate investment profile in the future could be. And that answers, how much should I be spending? And does my past investment align with needs? Are there things that I need to adjust in just the money that I already do spend? What are conditions like? And am I gaining or losing ground with respect to my backlog? And again, how do each of these findings compare to schools like mine? Perhaps the most important slide here is the one on that upper right side. Pete talked about it earlier, but we call it the moving target slide. But it's all about defining what the annual needs are and then figuring out where investment falls within that range of requirements. Am I gaining ground every year? Am I staying where I am, or am I losing ground? And then finally, we talked about this on the operations side. We're collecting budgets, staffing tables, org charts, work order reports, and anything related to utilities. And we're using that to develop metrics around daily service and planned maintenance costs, staffing measures, management coverage, work order performance, and utilities. Very important questions that we answer with things like, am I appropriating my operating expenditures correctly? And oftentimes, there's a need to become more effective on the plan maintenance side. Well, how can I reorganize to accomplish that? Do I have enough staffing? Is that staffing managed effectively? Are there opportunities that jump out where I can save dollars, and how can I find a way to repurpose those into annual stewardship or more asset enhancing maintenance? And then ultimately, does the community out there feel like they're being well taken care of, well served? So that wraps up the discovery process. What happens out of that is the ability to separate fact from fiction. It is the understanding of where you are and how you got here. Now there are tools that help us to look into the future. There are predictive analytics to help you monitor and manage risk. So here, for example, we are looking at a 10-year forecast in addition to current need. Are there projects that are going to be coming due that could present an inordinate amount of risk, and how do I address those before failure occurs? And this is an ability to not only talk about where I am now, but be able to appropriately prepare for the challenges that you might be facing in the future with respect to compounding physical needs. Also, a feature of our predictive analysis, what we call the cost forecaster, which is now that we've validated a lot of your information, we know how much you spend every year. We know how much staffing you have. We know how many utilities you consume. Well, what happens if I add a new residence hall? What happens if I renovate a library into a research laboratory? What happens if I demolish a classroom space? Because we have all of your information, we're able to model that. And not only that, but compare those modeled results to peer information, and then be able to export that so you can actually use those plans that you develop in your own presentation material going forward. And then finally, the ability to measure performance going forward is an ongoing process, but it's one which we are continually discussing your future objectives and determining what your areas of focus should be, identifying schools that do that particular thing very well, being able to create targets for you that get you closer to those best-in-class institutions, and be able to annually track your performance as you attempt to accomplish those strategic objectives. Very quickly, what to expect as a member. Typically, that entire benchmarking and analysis process takes roughly 18 to 20 weeks, and we are not on site for that entire time. Of course, it starts with a remote startup meeting, followed by some time on site, usually 2 to 3 days on site to wrap our hands around the information. We come back and we have what we call the qualification, where we are validating that with the team. We're revising that, and then we're coming back to campus for 2 presentations to the group that you decide. And then ongoing, all of our members have access to our member portal. That member portal is always there for you to be able to not only look at your own information historically, but also to generate your own comparative reports against institutions that are like you. You're able to edit your comp group and even design your own benchmarks if they do not exist on the site. So in a nutshell, that is a little bit about the mechanics by which we attain all of the information that Pete spoke about earlier. Again, thank you for your time. I'm going to throw it back over to Eric, but I believe we have time for questions if there are any.
Thanks, Jay. Actually, in monitoring, I don't think we've had any questions come in, and we are running out of time or have run out of time, so I'll close it out. So I just, again, like to thank you all for joining us today, and for those who stuck with us to the end, I hope that you enjoyed the session and found the information valuable as you continue to explore ways to transform your facility strategy and create a new facilities conversation on your campus. Please don't hesitate to contact us via our website, sightlines.com, or directly at insights@sightlines.com if you have any additional questions following today's call. Thank you all again, and I hope you have a great day.